NASA is preparing to shut down the ISS, the station that shaped life in orbit for more than 2 decades. But while NASA steps back, China is pushing forward. Tiangong is not slowing down. It is growing, adding new modules, and building systems that could keep it active well into the 2030s. If these timelines stay the same, China could run the only working station in orbit for years. That shift would change who leads, who follows, and who gets access to space. And it raises one question that almost no one wants to ask out loud. Why is NASA retreating at the exact moment China is moving to take the lead in orbit? For more than 20 years, the ISS stood as the center of human activity in low orbit. It was a station where crews from many nations trained, lived, and carried out science that shaped medicine, materials, and life support systems. The United States led the effort and carried most of the cost, which placed NASA at the front of orbital work for an entire generation. China was never part of that program. In 2011, the Wolf Amendment blocked NASA from working directly with China, which closed the door to any shared missions or ISS access. It was a clear message. If China wanted to place its own astronauts in orbit for extended stays, it would have to build an independent path. That decision pushed China toward a goal it had been preparing for since the 1990s. Once cooperation was off the table, the only option left was to construct a station of its own. China started small with Tiangong 1 and Tiangong 2. These were limited platforms, but they allowed China to test docking, long stays, and basic crew operations. Each mission added a new step in capability, and by 2021 the country was ready for its largest move yet. The Tianhe core module lifted off on a Long March 5B rocket, marking the start of the Tiangong station. 1 year later, the Wentian and Mengtian lab modules joined it in orbit, creating a full 3-module station in a short window of time. By late 2022, Tiangong was officially declared complete and ready for long-term use. While China was accelerating, NASA was preparing to shift out of the ISS era. The agency confirmed that the ISS will remain active only until 2030 before being guided into the atmosphere with a controlled deorbit craft built by SpaceX. Once that happens, the United States will rely on future commercial stations that are still under development. NASA's own watchdog has raised concerns about schedule and funding, creating uncertainty about whether these stations will be ready in time. China, meanwhile, plans to keep Tiangong active for more than 15 years. New modules are scheduled for launch later this decade, which would turn it into a much larger complex. China also continues to welcome international partners who never had access to the ISS. This creates a strange moment in space history. NASA is preparing to shut down the station that defined its role in orbit, while China is expanding the only other station in existence. And that leads to a simple question. How did the two biggest players in orbit end up moving in opposite directions at the exact same time? If Section 1 showed how China and NASA began moving in different directions, this section shows why China gained speed so fast once it committed to building its own station. The truth is simple. Tiangong did not rise in orbit through slow trial and error. It rose through a series of fast, calculated steps that stacked together with almost no pause. The shift began in April 2021 when China launched the Tianhe core module, the central piece of Tiangong. Instead of waiting years to expand it, China moved quickly. The Tianzhou 2 cargo craft arrived only weeks later with supplies, fuel, and equipment. Soon after, the Hsinchu 12 crew docked and began turning the module into a working home. That mission tested life support, docking systems, and a 10-meter robotic arm that would later handle some of the most complex tasks on the station. By mid-2022, China pushed Tiangong through its next stage even faster. The Wentian lab module launched in July and temporarily docked to the forward port before being moved to its permanent side berth using an indexing arm. Only a few months later, the Mengtian lab followed. It used the same docking and relocation process, creating the full T-shape of the station by November 2022. What made this stand out was not only speed but method. The US and its partners assembled the ISS through dozens of spacewalks. China moved entire modules robotically, without exposing crews unless necessary. It reduced risk, saved time, and showed that its assembly systems were ready for truly modular growth. By late 2022, Tiangong was not just complete. It was continuously occupied. China shifted to a steady rhythm of rotations, usually with 3 crew members aboard and brief 6-person overlap periods during handovers. This gave China something the ISS nation spent decades building: a trained, active astronaut corps with regular long missions instead of rare, scattered visits. In 2023 and 2024, crews carried out science, maintenance, and critical repairs after debris struck the station's solar arrays. These long spacewalks proved that Tiangong could survive real hazards and be maintained without long pauses. When the Shenzhou 16 crew returned in 2023, they released the first clear full station photos, confirming that the structure in orbit matched China's long-stated plan for a 3-module complex with room to grow. The pattern was becoming hard to miss. China built Tiangong fast, tested it under stress, staffed it continuously, and kept improving it. Which raises the next question. While China strengthened its station, what was NASA doing with the ISS and its future plans? While Tiangong was taking shape in orbit, NASA faced a different reality. The ISS was aging faster than its partners could upgrade it, and each year brought new concerns about cost, metal fatigue, and long-term stability. Running the ISS was becoming harder. Keeping it reliable through constant maintenance and resupply put pressure on NASA's budget in ways that could no longer be ignored. So the agency made a choice that would shape the next decade. It would retire the ISS around 2030 and guide it into the atmosphere using a dedicated vehicle built by SpaceX. This decision was not small. The ISS is the largest structure ever built in orbit. Its removal would close more than 20 years of shared work and shift responsibility for America's presence in orbit to a new and untested system. Instead of replacing the ISS with another government-led station, NASA turned to private companies. It began funding work on future commercial stations, hoping they would step in once the ISS was gone. The leading projects were Axiom Station, Orbital Reef, and Starlab. Each one promised a different model. Axiom planned to attach modules to the ISS before detaching them into a free-flying station later on. Orbital Reef proposed a large complex built by Blue Origin and Sierra Space. Starlab, led by Voyager Space and Airbus, planned a single launch station that would reach orbit fully assembled. All three were ambitious. All required major advances in design, funding, and launch schedules. And all faced the same fixed deadline, the ISS retirement date. The challenge was simple. These stations did not exist yet. None had flown. Most were still in early design or testing. NASA's own watchdog warned that delays, cost limits, and technical issues could push the timeline further out, leaving the United States without a working station for a period of time. The warning did not claim failure. It claimed risk. If commercial stations slipped by even a few years, NASA would have no direct presence in low orbit while the ISS was gone. Meanwhile, the costs of maintaining the ISS continued to rise. Its hardware was built in the 1990s and early 2000s. Every year added more stress to equipment that was already past its original life target. This pushed NASA toward the commercial model even harder. It was cheaper and shifted some responsibility to private operators. But while this plan moved forward, China was not slowing down. It was expanding its own station, adding modules, and presenting itself as a reliable base for international partners. And that leads to the next turning point. What happens if NASA steps back before its replacement stations are ready, while China's station keeps growing? As NASA moves toward retiring the ISS, a new concern has been rising among analysts. What happens if there is a stretch of time where the United States has no working station in orbit? This is not a theory. It is a clear possibility raised by NASA's own oversight reports, which warn that commercial stations could fall behind schedule due to cost limits, design changes, or launch delays. If that happens, the ISS could be gone before any replacement is ready, creating a gap in human presence for the United States in low orbit. That gap would not exist for China. Tiangong is fully staffed, carries a steady rotation of crews, and is set to grow with new modules later this decade. If that growth stays on schedule, China would not only keep its presence in orbit, it would expand it at the exact moment the ISS comes down. This creates a rare window in space history where a single nation could run the only working station in orbit until others catch up. The effects of that shift would not be limited to engineering. They would reach into politics, training, science, and long-term planning. Countries that once looked to NASA for support might turn to China simply because China has the active platform. Smaller nations with rising space programs, such as Pakistan and some Gulf states, are already working with China to train crews or run experiments on Tiangong. Once the ISS is retired, that interest could grow quickly. There is also a symbolic weight to the moment. For decades, the ISS served as a shared meeting point for many nations, with the United States at the center of it. If the only active station in orbit belongs to China, the image of global space work shifts. Students, scientists, and officials would see new missions launched to a Chinese-led outpost. The world would look up and see a station run by a country that was once excluded from the original program. Some analysts raise concerns about the practical side of this shift as well. China's space program operates through a combined civilian and military structure. This has led to questions about how the station could be used, what sensors it carries, and how the data might support other parts of China's space work. Nothing in the research points to open misuse, but the concern remains because transparency is not the same as in the ISS program. All of this builds to a simple point. If NASA steps away before its new stations are ready, China could shape low orbit for years. And that brings up the next issue. Is Tiangong strong enough to hold that role under stress? A station can look strong on paper, but real strength is proven only when something goes wrong. Tiangong reached that point sooner than China expected. Low orbit has become crowded with fragments from older missions, rocket stages, and past tests. Even tiny pieces can hit with enough force to damage hardware. The ISS has dealt with this threat for years. Now Tiangong faces the same risk. In 2023 and 2024, the station learned this lesson directly. Small debris struck parts of Tiangong solar arrays, leaving visible damage that forced the crew to plan long repairs. Chinese crews carried out spacewalks that lasted many hours to fix the panels and add new shielding. These repairs showed that Tiangong could be maintained under stress, but they also exposed how quickly debris can interrupt normal operations. Each hit might be small, but the number of fragments in orbit continues to rise, raising the threat for every station, old or new. Then, in late 2025, a more serious event unfolded. The Shenzhou 20 return capsule, which was docked to Tiangong as the crew's ride home, was found with a cracked window. The damage appeared to come from debris, and although the crack did not break the structure, it was enough to make the capsule unsafe for reentry. This left the crew in a difficult position. Their planned return had to be delayed, and engineers on the ground needed time to assess the damage. For the first time, Tiangong was not simply a place for science and training. It became a place where a crew waited for a safe way home. China's response was fast and firm. Within 16 days, it launched Shenzhou 22 as an uncrewed emergency craft. It carried a replacement return capsule along with supplies and spare parts. The craft reached Tiangong in about 3.5 hours after launch and docked without delay. This rapid action brought the station back to normal operation and gave the crew a safe path home. It was China's first true rescue mission, and it proved that Tiangong's support network on the ground was strong enough to react under pressure. These events did not weaken China's station. They strengthened its story. Tiangong faced real danger, handled repairs, and recovered from a serious threat. Each challenge showed that the station is not just a symbol. It is a working outpost with a crew, a ground team, and a system that can respond when things go wrong. And with proof that Tiangong can survive under stress, a bigger question appears. If China can handle emergencies now, what will the station become once it grows in size and capability? With Tiangong proven under stress, China is moving into its next phase. Later this decade, it plans to add an expansion module with several docking ports, turning the current 3-part station into a larger 6-module complex. Alongside this, the Xuantian telescope will fly in the same orbit and dock with the station for upgrades. This gives China something the ISS never had, a large observatory that can be serviced directly from a crewed outpost. These upgrades push Tiangong beyond a simple research lab and turn it into a long-term base with room to grow. This brings us to the peak of the story. If NASA retires the ISS in 2030 and private stations slip behind schedule, China could operate the only staffed station in orbit for a period of time. That gap would not last forever, but even a short window matters. It would shift training, science, and international partnerships toward the one station that is active and expanding. Several nations already work with China on experiments and crew training. That interest would rise fast if Tiangong becomes the only door into low orbit. Here is the real turning point. NASA is taking a risk by ending the ISS before a replacement is fully ready. China is taking the opposite path by building a broader platform and aiming to keep it active well into the 2030s. One side pauses, the other pushes ahead. NASA is taking a real risk here, and if the timing slips even a little, this choice could shift control of low orbit in a way that is hard to reverse. And that leaves a final question hanging over everything we have seen so far. If China holds the only working station in low orbit, even briefly, how will it use that lead?